We
Okay.
knew it was going to happen. I think it's kind of a bonus of talking about a Rian Johnson film. It's like, ooh, that lends itself to like a Star Wars tangent that we can get into.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast, where we discuss the world of film from a fresh angle. And now your host, Robert Yaniz Jr.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast. This is Rob. As you know, this show is all about leveling the playing field between fans and critics, and trying to give everyone a voice, really democratizing the film criticism world. There's been such a divide between film critics and between fans, and we've seen such kind of vitriol on both sides. And that's why on the Crooked Table Podcast, we're really about bringing in a fresh voice every episode and letting them talk about a movie that they really love. So this week, I'm joined by Adam Barnard of Screen Fever YouTube channel and the Home Experience podcast. Adam, it's good to have you back on the Crooked Table Podcast in this sort of, I guess, new version of it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think we both are very privy to the whole blockbuster world and just the culture behind how these movies are made. So while last time I was here to discuss Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, it'll be cool to dive into another kind of sci-fi epic, even though this one's based off an original property. So I'm seeing kind of a trend, especially with like the filmmakers behind these movies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because you and I have a very different take on this director's next project, which I'm sure we'll touch on. Just to get things started, tell the listeners a little bit about who you are, how we know each other, and what you're all about, and just do your sales pitch for everything that you have going on.
Yeah, so we know each other through a mutual friend named Michael Hinman, who was the editor at Airlock Alpha, which is kind of a now defunct sci-fi news site. But for a while there in the 2000s, it was a massive spoiler site. It had a lot of inside sources and was just very big in the whole movie, TV, sci-fi blogging before that actually became so widespread, like what we have now with clickbait. And Michael has always had a lot of integrity with what he did. And I met him at a Stargate convention as well. And I'm also intimately involved in Stargate fandom. I'm an editor at gateworld.net, and I contribute to the actual Stargate platform that MGM runs. So like I'm also very networked in sci-fi fandom. And I actually first heard about you because Michael sent me a script for like a web series that he wrote, and you were the co-writer on that. So that's where I saw your name, and I guess I must have just added you on Facebook. And at some point we started talking, and we found out we both, have this passion for film criticism and kind of having these real substantive discussions about the actual creative process and state of the industry, which is also what I do on Screen Fever, which is a channel that I run with actually my friend from film school, who's kind of starting to become a working director now, which is really cool to see. And he PAs a lot. He's on set a lot. But this is kind of like our little side project because he's active in the industry. But I think having him as a podcaster and having him, co-host these discussions about the film industry and make these video essays is just really cool to have his perspective, because he's still in the film industry while I've kind of moved to more, media and short form content. So that's our Screen Fever channel. And I'm also, like I said, I'm an editor at Gateworld, and I just try to I found a little nice niche for myself in the kind of sci-fi film community.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's definitely kind of the place to be as far as cinema right now. Everything, look at the box office. Everything is sci-fi or comic book or it's some kind of genre fair. So that makes a lot of sense that you'd move in that direction. And it's interesting how we sort of, because we've actually never met in person. It's just kind of been all online communication, like you said, back and forth. And it's interesting too because Michael is actually restarting his podcast, Alpha Waves Radio, that you can find online too. So Screen Fever, definitely listeners check that out. I know you said you're mentioning you're focusing more on video essays and that kind of content going forward.
Yeah, I mean, we started the channel in April, so it's still pretty new. I think Jax and I really wanted to do a podcast. We had talked about doing it since like freshman year of college. I mean, I know it's very much a thing of the decade to be like, dude, let's do a podcast. But like we want to actually try it. Point. Yeah, it is a cliche, so I don't feel like I'm bringing much individuality to my story right now. But like, it's just something where I think it was, regardless of how many people listened or who listened, it was an idea of personal enrichment to learn like a new artistic outlet and a new way of sharing ideas, because filmmaking is all about theme and telling stories and expressing yourself, and podcasting is just a much more direct way to do that. And you're not replicating a narrative. You're actually, in a very bare way, discussing your thoughts or your experiences or the knowledge that you've acquired on a certain subject. And like that to me was just really exciting as a means of like keeping my brain fresh, especially because I work from home. It's like a lot of the things I do, I'm not talking to people, so I just miss some of the social contact. I just think it's like, I think you enjoy it the most when you do it for yourself as well as others, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I mean, and I've been full-time freelance for the last 3 years, so I 100% know what you're talking about. I'm raising a little girl during the days and writing articles and trying to record podcasts amidst all that, and it's a good way to sort of stay plugged into to the industry that we both love.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. Like,
yeah, of course.
I think it's cool that you're rebranding and taking like a different approach. That's something I always encourage my friends to do, really whatever creative field they're in. And that's one thing that I had, I was indoctrinated with in my early years at film school. It's like the only reason people get hired, whether it's directors or producers or anyone in the studio system or a cinematographer, it's because you have something that literally no one else has.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? So like when I see my friends show me a song or a podcast or a movie, like I don't go easy anymore. I just say like, you have to like tell me, what is this bringing, or you know what I'm saying? Like what is, and not as like to be harsh. I just want them to find the kind of like kernel of an idea, and sometimes it's hard, but then I'm like, look, I know you and I know you're able to do this. It's like what do you have in your experience? Because everyone has that one special skill and everyone has that one special approach to kind of like their art, and I think people settle too easily. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's good to struggle and kick around ideas and constantly re-hit the drawing board, because then when you come out with your brand, it's yours. It's what you do. It's what people come to you when they want a certain kind of movie or a certain kind of podcast or a certain kind of YouTube channel. And in the mix of just a massive strata of content that we have now, you really, to stick out, just to even cut through the white noise, you need that.
Absolutely. I mean, it feels hackneyed at this point to say, the whole write what you know or create what you know, I guess, in this context. But it's really true. I mean, we're so inundated with content now. It's just like it's hard to cut through the temptation of just, well, this is what everyone else is doing, so let me do my version of that, and it ends up kind of sounding cookie cutter like every other version that you've sort of absorbed yourself. And I think I was sort of falling into that trap a little bit too, which is why I was like, all right, well, we're all talking about Marvel movies, so I guess I'm going to talk about the Marvel movie, just like every other podcast that I listen to. To sort of feel like part of that world. And it's interesting when you and I have these conversations, because you come from, and we did this for a conversation on your Screen Fever channel about the state of the fandom, is that you're coming from a little more of a creator standpoint, and I'm coming from a little more of like the journalist standpoint. And we kind of meet in the middle on those, from those two different, vastly different perspectives on the entertainment industry and where it's going and what's, what it all means, I guess. So, kind of touching back on the fact that we keep talking about sci-fi and that kind of thing, it makes sense that here we are again talking about another sci-fi film here. Actually, this week we're going to be talking about the 2012 sci-fi action thriller Looper from writer-director Rian Johnson. So let's listen to a little bit of the trailer right now.
In the future, time travel is outlawed. Used only in secret by the largest criminal organizations. When they need someone gone and they want to erase any trace of the target ever existing, they use specialized assassins like me, called loopers.
You're a looper?
You know what we do? And the only rule is never let your target escape, even if your target is you.
So, talking about this film, so this is basically a time travel thriller where it starts starring Joseph-Gordon Levitt as Joe, who is a looper, which basically means he's, I guess, kind of a hitman in the present day, where the future, as he likes to say a couple times in this movie, he does the whole monologue of, like, time travel hasn't been invented yet, but in the future, it's illegal. And really lays it on thick, the premise of this movie, from the very beginning. But in the future, the criminal element sends people back in time so that he can kill them, and he disposes of the bodies, and there's no, like, there's no trail
body
back.
tracking.
There's no.
In the future,
right,
it gets
exactly.
easier
Thank
to
you.
track.
Maybe you're better qualified to explain what the movie is about.
Yeah, I've watched it so many fucking times.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I watched it a lot when it came out, and just because I actually had a personal kind of connection to the movie. Can I go into this at the moment, or do you want to?
Well, let's just hit the giant broad strokes of the plot first.
For sure.
So,
yeah. It's funny because, like, I can compare the intro of this movie to another film I just reviewed on the Screen Fever podcast, which is Ready Player One, which I also like a lot because it's such complex worlds that even with these filmmakers like Rian Johnson or Spielberg, sometimes for the sake of just telling 90% of their story with clarity, they have to have that, voiceover narrating some kind of action that just tells you everything you need to know about the idiosyncrasies and the dynamics of these really complex futuristic worlds, and so, like, I know people usually like to knock films down a peg for doing this. Like, I think the first 10 minutes of Loop are absolutely fantastic. I mean, I just think they're the perfect iteration of the kind of voiceover sci-fi introduction,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So basically, Joe encounters, to get back to that part of it. So Joe basically, this is his job for years. It sounds like at this point he's earning all his silver bars. And then he encounters himself sent back through time and has to kind of wrestle with the decision of closing his own loop, as the film calls it, and sort of the journey that sets him on. So we should also say, since this is a 6-year-old movie and this podcast is not spoiler sensitive, we're gonna, when we launch
Spoilers.
into when we launch into the review section, we're not holding anything back. We're gonna go into the ending and everything, all the big plot twists, that kind of thing. So that's just kind of broad strokes. Joe's journey leads him to this farm where Emily Blunt and her son show up, and there's kind of a big shift halfway through the film, which we'll get into. So yeah, moving into why did you, the purpose of the Crooked Table podcast is to let guests choose their own films, what they wanted to discuss, and you and I went back and forth for a little while about what you wanted to talk about. So why did you land on Looper, and what was kind of your personal connection with it?
I landed on Looper for two reasons that I felt would be interesting. I mean, one, I have a personal connection to this movie, and I think it's a masterpiece, and I want to really dive into the creative merits of this particular standalone original sci-fi story, which honestly we don't see much of anymore, at least at this level, as a mid-budget feature film. And the second reason I chose Looper is because I really did not like The Last Jedi, and I thought that'd be interesting because, like, most people see, or a lot of people see, Last Jedi as this near perfect film, and I can't stand it. And I over here, see Rian Johnson direct Looper, which I think is this pitch perfect 10 out of 10 movie, which is interesting because I thought the tone of Last Jedi was all over the place. And, given our trend of kind of discussing the careers of these young filmmakers, who, in another life are just, our peers, or not really that much older than us in terms of, like, could have been in college classes with them for all we know. I think that's interesting to kind of track, like, our generation's artists, what I'm saying, instead of, like, discussing a Scorsese film or whatever, because that's just so far removed from my own personal experiences or tastes. So yeah, I think it'll be a good discussion.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, and I was alluding to earlier, I love The Last Jedi, and I'm actually kind of a big fan of Rian Johnson's films in general. So it's interesting that he's, this film was, I think, a decent sized hit. I don't know if it made, like, a lot of money. I should probably look that up on.
I think it was 170 off of a $30 million budget.
Okay,
so
170 worldwide.
Ratio wise, that's like almost 6-1. It's really good.
Yeah. So made about 66 domestically, 30 production budget. So yeah, that's definitely a solid hit for Rian Johnson. So it's interesting that he went from this film to The Last Jedi, and how he's become sort of a very divisive figure since this film was, I guess, really his kind of entrance into science fiction, because he'd done two sort of neo-noir kind of crime capers, and this film is kind of basically a combination of the neo-noir crime caper and like a sci-fi thriller.
Right.
Kind of the bridge between, Brick and the Brothers Bloom and The Last Jedi in that way.
Right. Yeah. And like, just another disclaimer here, another reason, like a sub reason why I chose this movie is I'm kind of low key sick of the vilification of Rian Johnson. Mm-hmm. To me, he made a bad movie, and he's also made 3 fantastic ones and done TV shows. It's like, get over it. Really. Like, even if it is, I know you don't think it's a bad movie, but even if it is just a really crappy, 2 out of 10 movie, it's like, so what? That doesn't nullify his, past, present, and future artistic qualifications or contributions. I just think it's really juvenile. So part of the reason that, even as somebody who might be classified with the hater group of Last Jedi, I want to come back and say, no, this guy is really talented. Let's look at something he did that personally resonated with me, and I thought was, one of the best possible iterations of itself. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely. For me, this film, I saw this in theaters when it came out, and I was a big fan of it. I thought it was really, really different than anything I was expecting, and the film has a ton of surprises going for it. And I think it was a really interesting ride, and it was one that I actually picked up. I actually had it on DVD. Like, I got it at like a Black Friday sale years ago, and I hadn't opened it until we were talking about doing this episode. I was like, I should probably go back and rewatch that, because I haven't seen it in 6 years.
So it's only your second time.
This is only my second time watching this. Yeah.
Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So that gives us an interesting counterpoint as far as our appreciations of this film. I think I still liked it. I think you said it sounds like you hold it in much higher esteem than I do, but I mean it's still it's a solid 4 out of 5 or whatever for me. So we're not.
So like, what's your knee jerk reaction having seen it again with fresh eyes for the first time in like half a decade?
I guess I think I forgot how weird it is. I guess I forgot like how. But one of the things like I remembered like the beginning. I remembered the sort of transition sequence there between Joseph-Gordon Levitt and Bruce Willis. I remembered the ending. Actually, one of the ones that stuck in my head the most was sort of future Seth and his like falling apart because as they're torturing Paul Dano's character.
Right.
That whole thing, like that was burned into my memory from 6 years ago. Being like, oh man, that's the guy's like body parts are like disappearing because he's being kind of cut apart and stuff. So that's
such a clever scene.
Yeah, it's kind of very horrific. I feel like it's one of the most like impressive as far as it's hard to forget that moment when you're watching it. And he's like trying to hit the brake on the car, and his like foot disappears. It's crazy. It's
kind of like a deeply psychologically horrific concept that you're being tortured by someone mutilating your younger self, and across like a 30-year time period you're feeling the effects in real time. Like you're completely powerless to prevent your own dismembering. Like that's terrifying shit, man.
It is.
Like it's not even that graphic of a scene. It's just the concept is so terrifying that like it sticks with you.
And this film does a lot of messing with that, whether it's the carving on the arm of messages between Joe and old Joe, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of like Bill and Ted, where they're like, oh, we need to go and put this item over here so we can go get it later. Okay, I'll remember. And then there it is. That kind of thing, like playing with the dynamic of time travel.
It's almost strangely comedic. Yeah. Like it's not played for comedy in the movie, but when you think about it, it's like these guys are carving out words in their arm with like a knife
to
communicate with each other. And like there's a great scene in the diner where young Joe carves out Beatrix on his arm, who's one of the waiters. And so old Joe gets the reference, and he comes and meets him at the diner, and he's like, and Bruce Willis, old Joe, says to young Joe, he's like, There's a girl that works here on the weekends. Her name is Jen. It's only 3 letters. Yeah, it was just like it's this low key, funny, dark comedy that kind of is so tastefully sprinkled into the story to kind of recognize the inherent ridiculousness of some of these plot threads and some of these world building dynamics.
So what do you think of the kind of the vision of the future that this film, and then we'll get more into the time travel part of it.
Yeah. Okay, so here's where the film has flaws, in my opinion. Okay. I don't know if it was an issue, minor flaws, very minor flaws, but I don't know if it was an issue of budget, because the movie, $30 million is just a lot of money, but in blockbuster filmmaking, it's like pennies.
Well, plus how much of that went to Bruce Willis? I mean,
and that's the oh my god, here. That's the other thing. Yeah, it's like may as well lop off like a third of the budget right there, right. Plus back end. The future is almost indistinguishable from some places in the present, and like just from a simple production design standpoint, we're 30 something years in the future and we still have like a 2002 Ford Explorer which runs fine. There's no, I mean, they didn't even dress the cars to be anything different. Everything about the loopers and the technology they use, like the blunderbuss and kind of like maybe like the social hierarchy or the greater geopolitical dynamics of like wealth disparity and dystopia, like all of that works fine, I guess. Like adding these little futuristic trinkets, like the design is cool. It's just, for being such a logical movie, the production design of the future is so illogical that it hits an uncanny valley that just like kind of nags at me as I watch it. But again, I can overlook it because of the immense quality and fortitude of all the other elements, specifically the characters and the themes, which just anchor the entire film.
Right. Yeah. No, don't they have like some kind of a sort of a speeder bike kind of deal going on in this movie too?
Yeah, and then we have a Mazda Miata, which just looks like a 2008 Mazda Miata or whatever. It's just like you gotta at least bridge the gap somewhere, Like the speeder bikes are cool as shit, but it just doesn't make sense to appear next to these cars. And it feels a bit lazy, which Ed Verreau's great. Like Ed Verreau designed Jurassic World, who is the production designer on Looper, and I love that kind of interpretation of real life theme park meets old Jurassic Park. And right. Like, he's a great designer. He's designed some other fantastic movies. So I guess we can just chalk it up to budget, or maybe just a little bit of sloppiness in the world building side.
Well, but at the same time, there's also, you could go too far with it. You watch sci-fi movies from maybe the 80s, like Blade Runner, and that's supposed to be 2019. It does not look like Blade Runner. And we're almost in 2019. Where is all the giant, where are the spacecrafts floating above us, and like all the neons, right. You know what I mean? So I feel like I understand. I agree with your point to a certain extent, but it's also like I feel like if they had pushed it too far, then we would have been like, okay, how far in the future is this supposed to be?
Well, yeah, like another film.
It doesn't go far enough, but yeah. So I mean, I agree with that.
Interesting counterpoint. I agree with you, because like another film that came out almost at the same time as Looper, which I saw in theaters, was the remake of Total Recall, which was just completely bloated. I mean, it was cool, but it was completely bloated with all this CGI that just looks like, I mean, every shot looks like a painting, but it just doesn't serve the story or kind of the action. So yeah, I mean, it almost makes Rian Johnson's Looper look grounded compared to some other blockbusters that were coming out at the time. So like, it's not necessarily a bad thing. At least Rian doesn't kind of rely so heavily on visual effects. And like, we look at visual effects from 2012 now, it's like, it looks outdated already. Oh, yeah, I mean, I can't imagine what it's gonna look like in 10 years from now. But Looper, you could watch like 50 years from now and it's gonna look real. So like, I appreciate, again, like, I think a theme that I'm seeing come here is like the artistry of Looper. Right. There's just so much to talk about and so much to appreciate, even if occasionally you're missing the mark conceptually.
Right. I think if he'd had a little bit of a bigger budget, he might have, extrapolated on the world building side of it a little bit. But yeah, I think there's also a danger there, like as you said, about going overboard with it, and then it completely overshadows the narrative that he's trying to tell.
Certainly, but like let's look at The Last Jedi. Like the stuff on Canto Bight, the casino planet, looks fantastic. I mean, that's what he can do with a big budget. You know, it looks like Monte Carlo in space with like these giant horse races with alien horses. And like, while I have problems with that set piece with, you know, I don't think the characterization, the plot elements are as strong as Looper. It's very clear that he can craft entertaining and intriguing set pieces. You know what I'm saying? Like he has such a wealth of stylistic influence that just what he creates for most of his movies ends up being really unique.
Yeah, I think that's true. What do you think about the way that the time travel actually, like the time machine in this thing is basically like a little, I don't know, a little box that you put yourself in. Like it looks like almost like
it's like Jules Verne
or like Jeff Goldblum thing from The Fly. It's like you go in this little pod and you close the door and then it lights up and you're 30 years in the past. What do you think about the way that he sort of illustrated the time travel part of it? And then we can get into like, I guess, how the mechanics of how that works.
I think it's fine. It just looks like a steampunk fusion reactor, you know, that's like maybe a little submarine vessel from like a Jules Verne type, you know, again, this is just talking about his influences. He probably likes some of that steampunk stuff. He said, let's make it look like a little mini submarine. You know, it's like, I appreciate the idea behind it. And again, like I wasn't really thinking about, I didn't really care how the time machine worked. You know, this is the kind of movie that says you're either going to buy that he's stepping into a time machine or you're not. Well, I mean, you know, for some people it matters. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to belittle what you're saying. Just for me, like, you know, some people care about those little details. Other people are willing to just overlook that and go along with the ride. And like, you know, I thought the time machine was fine. I think the bigger issue that a lot of people had and that I wrestled with, and now I've landed on the side of liking it, but at first I didn't, is the whole dynamics of the time travel itself. Because there's plenty of paradoxes and there's kind of contradictions about how any of this is even at all possible. And the movie kind of straddles the line in terms of totally explaining it and not explaining it at all. And if you're not on board with that, you're going to hate this movie. And I have several friends who do because of that very reason.
Well, I mean, cinematically, and I guess in any kind of story, there's really kind of two approaches to time travel. There is, you can go back and change things, which is the more popular because it's easier to understand, to conceive of. And then there is the, like, I think even the Time Machine kind of adheres to this. And there's a great, I think it's a Spanish film named Time Crimes, which I don't know if you've seen, but that basically the point of it is, and I think Primer is like this as well. I'm not sure. I haven't seen that one in a long time. I think basically, you know, you can't go back and change things because it would have already been that way. It's like, you know, time is a straight line, not that you can go back and affect the past. And I think this film wisely simplifies it by just going with, you know, you can change the future by going back in the, you know, it makes it the time stream sort of malleable in that way. And it's interesting too because Rian Johnson clearly doesn't want to get caught up in that debate of it all, which is why he has the scene at the diner where Bruce Willis is like, literally, don't ask me about time travel because they're going to be making diagrams with straws. He's like, it doesn't matter. And he's like all pissed off. And basically Rian Johnson like looking at the camera like, did you guys get that? You know?
Right. So I have a really interesting story about this, right? When I was at film school in 2012 at the USC summer program, Rian Johnson visited our class before Looper came out and he brought the script for us to read. And I read the original Looper script, and at that diner scene, there's a huge chunk of their interaction that is literally dedicated to drawing straws, with making, you know, organizing salt, and literally explaining how time travel works in Looper. And it even has in the script like basic illustrations copied and pasted in of what they're doing on the table with the straws and the salt and explaining this. Yeah, I mean, the scene goes, I mean, Rian Johnson likes long scenes, so this scene's like a whole page that isn't in the diner scene. The one line that is Bruce Willis saying, I don't want to talk about time travel because we'll end up, you know, playing with straws and salt on the table all day. The reason that was in there is because they shot a whole fucking page of them actually doing that. And they I think they just lifted that out of the scene in post. And then that line is left over, but somehow that line still works, even though, you know, the entire event. The way the scene plays out has been totally changed through that omission. And second thing, part of that story is that we read the script before Ryan came and visited our class, and he asked everyone, what was your favorite part of the script? And I raised my hand. I'm like, I loved the scene where you explain the time travel. It was fantastic. It made so much sense. It adds such richness to everything that's happening. And I see his face start to wait for me to finish talking. I'm like, shit, what did I say? He's like, yeah, that's all gone. Like, we cut every explanation out. It's like, all right, what the fuck do I know? Like, I'm this 17-year-old idiot who's like telling him to put back all the time travel stuff. But again, like, it works better without it, because the more the movie tries to explain itself, the more I think its reasoning is going to implode. So we just have to take the time travel and the whole grandfather paradox thing for what it is and roll with the story.
Yeah, and I think it's good that, I mean, it reminds me of like an Austin Powers, where he's like, oh, just forget about that kind of time travel thing and just enjoy yourself, that kind of thing.
Literally,
it pretty much is that. And I think in a way that's probably the smarter way to play it, because going into a complex explanation, I think probably just would have alienated more of the audience than it would have won over in a way. So I don't hold that against the movie. I don't hold it against the movie. I just think it's kind of an interesting way of dealing with it. Like, oh, because it is, okay, this is all fiction, let's just roll with it. It's interesting too that that's really kind of the only extended interaction that the Joseph-Gordon Levitt character and Bruce Willis character really even have. Bruce Willis,
I didn't notice that.
He's top billed in this movie, but he doesn't show up until I guess the very end of Act 1, and then barely has dialogue. I mean, he has a few, that's his big dialogue scene in the movie. He's just kind of basically the Terminator for most of the film, hunting down all these small children. So it's interesting, the kind of dynamic of Joe as kind of a hero and a villain. And the way that so what do you think about that fact, and the way that they barely interact throughout the course of the movie, and the way that I guess dynamic as evolves over the course of the film between the two of them?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because the first act of the movie, the first 30 minutes of the movie, is like its own mini movie.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
Like explains the world, introduces the character, gives that character challenges to overcome, paints that character as a very lonely figure, a morally bankrupt figure who also understands his own depravity and is seeking to find connection. It's not even cultivating plot elements, it's cultivating more theme. Mm-hmm. So when he meets Sid and when he meets Emily Blunt's character, when he has, his life changed, we have so much context for what he's feeling. Old Joe showing up is literally the end of Act 1. Like, it's the perfect plot point when you think about it. It's like,
right.
Your loop is closed and he escapes. You come face to face with your older self and you fail to pull the trigger. And the consequences of that and the ramifications of that are planted with Seth's character, with the character of Seth, played by Paul Dano, who lets his loop run, and you see the absolute chaos, which is where that scene comes where they torture his young self to kill his older self. So, like, again, it's just so economical for 30 minutes of storytelling to set up, closing your loop and really just understanding Joe. I know I'm rambling, but like, I love the scene where he's with Piper Parabo's character, the prostitute Susie. It's like when I'm young, I didn't really get it, because when you're 17, you're like, oh, look, she's naked, she's topless. And now it's like, God, it's such a gut punch in terms of like, seeing how he betrayed his friend, and he's like, that was the only connection he had with any of his coworkers of, his camaraderie of hitmen, and it's just like he's literally trying to find love with a prostitute, and it's just like such a he's very sympathetic figure, even though that he does terrible things, and actually, as you see in the film, kind of does way more. And it's interesting, the narrative structure here, because it does spend basically a half hour explaining, this is the world, this is what loopers are, blunderbuss, and all the terminology and how the world functions, and setting the stakes, as you mentioned, with Paul Dano's character. But then when old Joe sort of takes off, it kind of has like a little Minority Report moment where he's like, I'm going to solve this. Oh, everybody runs. That kind of thing. So true.
And then he falls off the fire escape, and all of a sudden it resets to showing us old Joe's journey to getting to this point, and how he killed this guy, and he killed himself or whatever, and then took off and went traveling, and how he how he developed into, I guess, spent all the silver that he had, and then got into more criminal activities, like there's basically a hitman in Asia, it seems like, and fell in love and all of that stuff. That's what did you think about that choice to explain Joe's situation, and then at that critical juncture be like, oh, we got to get you up to speed with old Joe so you understand where he's coming from, and just basically he has because there's a whole sequence there where it's just 7 years later, 10 years later, like it's kind of jarring in an intriguing way, but it's just basically puts the current story on hold to delve into a totally different character in a way.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, the first time I saw Joe fall off the ladder and then have the next few minutes play out, it confused the absolute hell out of me, because I thought he had died. And that's part of that's still something I think might be a flaw. It's like the way his fall is covered, the way he falls off a very high ladder. And the slow motion fall, the fact that he lands on his back, it's like the dude's dead. Like, he broke his back. So this is his next loop. Now you're thinking like, okay, what happened? Did we start over again? Because like, again, we come back to that field where you see the zigzag cloud in the background. So it signifies we've been here before. And it's completely, like Jeff Daniels says, this time travel crap just fries your brain like an egg. I just think it wasn't very clear what happened. So I was so confused the first time I saw it. But if you're asking about what I thought of how that whole sequence played out with old Joe and how they go on the run, like, if I understood it, which I did obviously in subsequent viewings, I think it's a great way to complicate the plot, and it keeps everything on the character. Because if this movie, honestly, per our earlier point, if this movie had $200 million, there's an intimacy to all the action and the conflict and the killing and the betrayal, which makes it more rewatchable and gives it more texture than just a shoot 'em up would. And then that's part of the reason why I think this movie is good.
Yeah, and I think that scene, I mean, you're saying how jarring it is. I think it's supposed to be. I think you're going to spend the whole first 30-something minutes or whatever following Joe's arc, and sort of the I guess, major inciting event there with old Joe's sort of arrival. And I think that you're supposed to, it takes you out of what you would expect from a film like this, and throws off throws in a non-linear loop which makes sense, because the whole point of the movie is everything is how the memory is changing as certain events are taking place, and sort of the I don't know. I'm trying to think the cyclical nature of time, and be like, okay, well, this is what happens here, but what if this had happened? And I think it really underscores the themes of the film by kind of the way that sort of drastic cut from the fall off the fire escape or whatever to old Joe's side of things. So I have to get this out of the way. Also, what do you think? I think another big criticism that a lot of people had of this film then, and probably more so now. How do you feel about the Joseph-Gordon-Levitt makeup? Do you think do you see it's distracting? Do you think it's necessary? I mean, couldn't they have made this movie without that? Because I think a lot of people are like, why did they make Joseph-Gordon-Levitt look, more like Bruce Willis? I mean, do you think that was important?
So I know some of the business aspects to it, so I don't know if that's a proper explanation or justification.
Oh, I feel like I have heard about some of that, actually.
Rian Johnson had this Looper idea as a short film from like the time he did Brick with Joseph-Gordon-Levitt. And he had a working relationship with Joseph-Gordon Levitt. So when he designed the character of Joe in Looper, it's like, Joseph-Gordon-Levitt has to play that character. So he had been Joseph-Gordon-Levitt had been attached for a while. When you make, risky, original, mid-budget sci-fi movie ideas like this, you need a real star to anchor it. You need someone like Bruce Willis. So at that point, when you cast Bruce Willis, it's like, do I drop my friend on his ass to find a lookalike for Bruce Willis, or do we bridge the gap? And then the other problem is, well, Bruce Willis is a freaking dick to work with. I hope this doesn't lose many jobs. So like he's not going to want to sit in the makeup chair to look like Joseph-Gordon Levitt. Right. So now Joseph-Gordon Levitt has to look like Bruce Willis.
I mean, yeah, no offense to Joseph-Gordon Levitt, who's a great actor, and I think was really kind of on a hot streak around this time. This was like, I think, at the same year or the year before or whatever, with like 50-50 was coming out, and he was in all kinds of stuff in the early 2010s. But I mean, Bruce Willis, for the average moviegoer, he's the one that puts the asses in seats, even though he's not the lead of this movie. I mean, he does get top billing for that reason. But do you think? I mean, couldn't they have just had Joseph-Gordon Levitt look like Joseph-Gordon Levitt and just suspension of disbelief that he grows up to look like Bruce Willis?
Sure, I see your question now. I probably answered it the wrong way. I think it looks fine. I think the makeup looks fantastic. Like, I think the only reason it doesn't look right is because we know what Joseph-Gordon Levitt is supposed to look like, and it's really jarring for us to see such a familiar face being almost look like they've done like visual augmentation to his face, like Tarkin in Rogue One. It's like it almost looks like Peter Cushing, but something's off. Mm-hmm. That's kind of like this. It almost looks like Joseph-Gordon Levitt, but if you don't know what he looks like, I don't think it'll bother you. I think the makeup itself is quite fantastic.
Yeah. I could see that. It's just worth pointing out because if we do know what he looks like, because if we do know what he looks like, we come to it, and I could see some people looking at Joseph-Gordon-Levitt and be like, "Why does he look like a Dick Tracy villain right now?" That kind of thing. I don't think it takes away from the movie. I think it's just kind of a curious thing. I'm like, but that young people play younger versions of another actor all the time. I don't think Kate Winslet looks that much like Gloria Stewart, but they made it work. It's like
it's kind of like Michael Fassbender looks nothing like Steve Jobs, yet I think the Danny Boyle movie is just absolutely fantastic.
Oh, I love that movie. Or Ian McKellen, really, if we're going to talk about Fassbender. He doesn't really look like Ian McKellen either.
Oh, right.
And they were even in the same movie, in Days of Future Past, going back and forth, like, oh, this is the same guy. Like, they don't have the same voice. They don't look, Right. So it's kind of a curiosity because I feel like most movies would have just been like, oh, no, it's just he's JGL and he turns into Bruce Willis. Let it be. And
I think it's about their chemistry. Right. It's about their dynamics. And Bruce Willis and Joseph Gordon-Levitt obviously have chemistry. And Joseph Gordon-Levitt did a great job picking up some mannerisms and vocal inflections that mirror
totally
Bruce Willis. So that was, then again, he wouldn't even need the makeup to do that. It's just because he's a damn good actor.
Right.
I wanted to ask you a question about the two Joes. That's kind of like a bit philosophical. The older Joe is kind of on a bit of a crusade when he comes back in time. He basically has decided that I need to go back and make sure that Joe meets this woman that I'll have a wonderful life with in the future. And I have to stop the Rainmaker. It's like he has two purposes. One is to save the future from the supervillain, essentially. As cheesy as that sounds, there's someone who has a genetic mutation that basically gives them massive amounts of power, and they're killing everyone in the future. They've killed all his friends, so he has to basically go back and kill this little kid if he can find him. And then also make sure Joe moves to China and meets this woman who's going to clean him up from being a drug addict. And this time watching the movie, with a more mature perspective, I'm like, Joe is such an asshole. Mm-hmm. I personally agreed with young Joe, where it's like, you're old, you've lived your life, now buzz off. Just because you've already come back in time, you've changed everything. He said, show me the picture of her so I know never to meet her. I know never to say hi to her. She won't get killed. I actually thought young Joe was being reasonable and old Joe was being a stubborn old man who was letting his own ego destroy an entire timeline. And I hadn't really picked that up because, again, this movie is a lot of layers to it and is actually way more mature and heady than people give it credit for. So as I get older and, pocket more life experiences, I view it in entirely different ways. And asking you as someone who's I don't want to say this without sounding like a jerk, but significantly older than me,
right?
A couple years older than me. How can I say it to
sound
really
I'm what
you're in your 30s.
A decade. Yeah, I'm over a decade older than you. Yeah.
You're about a decade. We'll just say you're a decade older.
Yeah.
You're married. You have a kid.
Right.
What do you think about their dynamic? Who is right? Who's on an ego trip. Are both of them wrong? Like, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I think objectively, I think young Joe is right, because sure, old Joe's motivation is to kill the Rainmaker at this, when he's still a child and save his wife, but ultimately he's only doing that for his very selfish reasons. Like, he's not doing that, I have to save the universe. Or like, he's not, you know what I mean? It's not, there's no altruistic side to his mission. It's just, he's upset because his wife got killed and he wants to prevent that from ever happening. And I think your read is correct. I think you're supposed to kind of see it that way, especially with the way that the film ends, that young Joe sort of basically just makes that choice for him.
Right.
And but at the same time, I think it's a motivation that you can understand, so that you empathize enough with old Joe's mission that you understand that he feels like he has, like, coming from a point of emotional desperation, that he feels like he doesn't want to murder these children, but he feels like he has no choice, and that he's lived a life of decades of despicable behavior. And as you were saying, young Joe is already kind of morally bankrupt. Old Joe goes to so much darker places and feels like he only had recently gotten his shit together because he fell in love with this woman that, you see that she's like helping him through withdrawals from all the drugs that's in his system, and kind of rehabilitating him as a man, basically. And
at an old age, too. It takes a while to find redemption.
Well, that's like, 20-something years into the 30-year story.
He's already bald.
He's like, I've only been nice for like the last 5 years, but I don't want all those decades to be for nothing.
Well, yeah, old Joe is acting emotionally.
Right.
He's acting irrationally. He's not really thinking this through. And that's mostly because his wife was just shot before his eyes in terms of how he's lived things out. However, at the same time, like, young Joe is kind of sleazy. It's something where it's like, he's so arrogant. He's just basically telling himself to go die. It's like, he's like, why don't you do what old men do and die? And he comes off as a bit of an unsavory character. So like, the first time I watched it, I'm like, I hate both these characters. I don't hate both these characters, but I don't like their perspectives.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And then like with young Joe, it's like, it's really interesting to have a sleazy protagonist put in a position or make a point that I'm even like, yeah, well, that's how things should go down.
Well, in a way, it's funny because both of them have a plan for their life from this point going forward. Like, old Joe had finally gotten his act together. He'd fallen in love. They were happy. They were like trying to have a kid or whatever at that point. And then young Joe's like, I'm saving up my silver. I'm going to finish what I'm doing here. I'm going to go travel. I'm going to go to France, even though there's the running joke of everybody saying, go to China. He's like, Jeff Daniels like, I've been in the future. Go to China. That kind of thing. But basically both of them are struggling to hold on to the plan that they have set for themselves and the direction that their life was going in. It's really, they're just both trying to hold on to their status quo, which creates an interesting conflict because it's the same person both of them trying to keep their life, moving in a certain direction at various points.
Right. Absolutely. A funny story about the China thing, or the France-China dynamic. Originally, Joe was going to go to France, and everything that took place in China was going to take place in France. When they were in pre-production, they found out they couldn't budget for France, so they'd have to double like New Orleans for France. And Rian Johnson felt that like it was just going to come off as a cheat. It wouldn't authentically feel like they're in Paris or they're in France. But the script had already been written where he's learning French. So again, this is how, like, in his movies, Rian Johnson, when he encounters problems, like when he shoots a scene where they explain time travel and it doesn't work, he actually finds humor in it, or he finds a creative solution to cutting it out. And in this, in this iteration of Looper, the first half is the same, where it's like, I want to go to France, I'm learning French, But business-wise, they got a huge deal from a production company in China, and they're very limited with how many American movies they co-finance or even allow to be distributed in China. So around 2012 was a huge untapped market. To get a movie distributed or co-financed by a Chinese production company was like hitting the jackpot. So the creative roadblock they ran into by not being able to shoot in Paris or double in New Orleans actually resulted in an opportunity in China, and also a lot of humor where it's like, I'm from the future, go to China, which is kind of meta, in terms of like all the industry and film business that has been developing in the last few years in China. So I liked how he kind of compromised by having both the French and the Chinese dynamics in there. And also like the set pieces in China look fantastic. I just love the flair it gives the movie. It gives a visual distinction and a kind of removal from the very grounded, Midwestern American town compared to older Joe's life in China.
No, I love the way that I think that I agree with you. I think a lot of all those set pieces look really great, and the cinematography in this film is amazing. And the score by, I think it's Nathan Johnson, which I think is his brother. Isn't that Rian Johnson's brother? Or cousin? Okay, yeah, I knew it was related to him somehow. And I think, not because of the last name, but also because I'd heard that he was related to him. That Last Jedi was the first movie I think he didn't score of his.
Right, yeah.
So, yeah, no, I think that I love the way he does find those sort of playful solutions for issues like that, like kind of during the production, and is able to kind of shift the narrative on a dime for practicality's sake. And then he makes it look like it's been intentional the whole time. It's
exactly. And so it's the work of a master to kind of like make all his mistakes looks like intentional creative decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. I've sort of intentionally been kind of focusing on the first half of the film because because it does take such a drastic shift halfway through. I mean, we were talking about how Act 1 is really setting the stage for things. Act 2 is really like the clash between young Joe and old Joe and sort of sorting out what they're going to be each be doing for the rest of the film, where he gets the list of the three houses and young Joe sort of rips off part of it. And then from that point on, I mean, we're following this sort of, it is kind of a chase movie for that, like, I guess, second 30-minute chunk of the movie. And then all of a sudden we cut out to a field, and it's Emily Blunt chopping wood and smoking an imaginary cigarette, and just kind of, you're like, wait, what the hell happened? It's like, it really takes a huge shift halfway through. And they established a lot of the groundwork for that earlier with the Rainmaker and with the fact that there are people that are telekinetic, basically they call them TK, that I guess is like 10% of the population or something. How did you feel about them sort of folding, I guess, telekinetic powers into this world? Did that feel like one asks too much of a film like this? And you're already being like, hey, time travel is also people can move stuff with their minds.
I mean, I don't think so. I think it worked well. I also think, given the dichotomy between the first half of the movie and the second half of the movie, how it makes an ostensibly rigid transition, but when you look at it closer, it actually makes all the sense in the world. Mm-hmm. With the stuff that Joe's personal journey and the Rainmaker and the mutation and the time travel and the kind of culture around this specific timeline, that's kind of like a dystopian future. I think it threw a lot of people for a loop, no pun intended, because it was marketed as a very big dystopian gang thriller time travel movie, and didn't really make it clear that the entire second half of the movie would be taking place in some Midwestern farm. So it's like you start to get into it. It's like there's all these gangs, Gap Men. It's like this cool futuristic mob, and then it's like meet Emily Blunt and her 5-year-old, and that's the rest of the movie. I didn't like it at first. I actually kind of lost interest, both when I read the script before the movie came out. I was kind of like, what did I miss? Why are we on a farm? Like, why do I care? Mm-hmm. And again, I was younger. I was more bullish. I didn't really understand. I didn't have the same kind of filter to pull out themes and through lines. So yeah, when it first came out, when I first read it, it did not work for me. And now I watched it with fresh eyes, I think for the first time in several years, as well as you. And I was just surprised at how much I liked it. Like, I was like, oh my God, everything I didn't like about that transition, I think is the strength of the movie. It's like how it develops the characters and takes the movie in an unexpected turn. it keeps it so fresh, and it's like it differentiates, it separates itself from the pack of other kind of mid-budget thriller movies that just play out in an arbitrary fashion. It really is special.
Yeah, because the first half of the movie, it's introducing the world, and then the story sort of expands out, and then all of a sudden, whereas traditional movies would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and usually have a beam in the sky or like CG army or something, it's like halfway through this movie's like, nope, and like constricts itself down to really 3 people on a farm, and it becomes sort of a bottle episode of itself in a way. And I think that's a really interesting take, because having only watched this for the second time, the first time I did remember being like, wait, what the hell is going on? Because it becomes a much slower paced movie in a way, but no, it doesn't suffer for it. It's just, it's not what you're expecting, and you're all hyped up with the first half of the movie, and then I think it does really dial in on a lot of the themes, and also driving a pretty significant parallel between Joe and Sid, as far as like the ending, which we'll get to in a little bit, and sort of the dark path. Because at the end, when he's talking about the dark path, I could see the bad path. I could see it all laid out before him. It feels like he's talking about both himself and Sid in a way. I think he ends up really talking about more himself in that moment, but it really kind of hones in on what Joe ultimately will become, and at the same time raising a bunch of other themes, as far as me watching this as a parent, as the nature versus nurture thing. Is like, well, would this kid turn out to be this way if Emily Blunt is there to raise him? Which that was her whole point throughout the movie. He has these flare-ups where he just loses his temper, and she just goes and hides to protect herself, so she doesn't get accidentally killed.
Safe.
Yeah, in a safe,
in
exactly.
Like a 2-foot safe. That's such a funny concept. It's very strange to watch it. You literally have to lock yourself in like a bulletproof safe to save yourself from your child.
My kid has tantrums, but I don't have to like run away just for my own like safety.
Right. It's such a weird dynamic.
Yeah. So it raises a lot of those those questions about how your upbringing affects what you ultimately become, and the sort of the crossroads that Joe is faced with in the finale. And I want to just point out that I thought Pierce Gagnon, who hasn't really, I don't feel like he hasn't, the little boy, I feel like he hasn't really done has he done as prominent a role subsequently? I don't really think so.
No, he was in Tomorrowland, which was really bizarre. It was
like
but it wasn't
George Clooney, I think, in like the first like 15-20 minutes or whatever. Yeah, it was
bizarre. It was a totally different role. He delivers a powerhouse of a performance in this film. He hits like all the core emotional food groups with just disturbing precision for someone who's like 5 years old. Like regret, anger, empathy, loneliness, fear, trauma. Like, it's just God. And I just think when kids can deliver a performance that sophisticated, I almost want to like get inside their head and find out how they've accumulated such wisdom or such sensitivity at such a young age with so few life experiences and influences. Like when Sid talks about how he accidentally killed his mother, or at least it's his aunt, but who he thinks is his mother. He's talking about how he wasn't strong enough to stop it. It's like your heart cracks in half. Like when you listen to this kid talk and you get to know him. And then, 10 minutes later, you start to wonder, does this, God, I don't even know how to approach this tactfully, but like, would Joe be justified in
is it for the greater good? Basically.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, how many millions of lives could be saved if you kill this kid? Is there any justification for doing that? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Under what circumstance is murdering a child?
That took a dark turn.
The right move.
I really don't want to endorse killing a 5-year-old on some podcast.
I think that's basically what the movie is kind of asking you, though, too. That's like the film starts in a dark place and goes like darker and darker and darker to the final point, to finally where that's the question it's asking. It's like, should he kill this kid? What do you think, audience? For clarification's sake, he actually played the younger brother of Brent Robertson's character in Tomorrowland.
Okay. Yeah.
But yes, I mean, he both strikes a chord as like, you know, the stereotypical like creepy child mode. Like he hits a lot of those points.
From a horror movie, yeah.
It feels like very omany in certain moments there when he's staring down, you know, what's his name, Jesse, I think the guy that comes in there, the Gap Man.
Yeah.
See, I just saw it, so I remember it's very fresh in my head. And but at the same time, your heart also breaks for him when he's in tears and like kind of emotionally, you know, bearing his soul to his mom and stuff. And I think, for such a young actor, and considering how dicey children actors can be a lot of times in film, this is he does a lot with ultimately not that much screen time. I mean, they're only in the second half of the movie, and he has a lot of key scenes and gets like really makes the most impact with the material that he does have. He was another one of the things that really stood out in my mind, having only seen this movie once 6 years ago. The child performance that he gave in that, and it's interesting to see where that goes. Really, the performances across the board are pretty solid here. I mean, we mentioned JGL is really great, and I feel like I don't know where feels like he's faded off a little bit in the last few years. I don't know if that's because The Walk was not a particularly big hit, or
he's had a string of mediocre movies. He's in Snowden and The Walk, and I mean, he does great in all those movies. It's just they're, you know, kind of they're at least received as duds. You know, whether or not they're good, it's like he's kind of had a losing streak in terms of roles. I still think he's borderline a household name after everything he's done. Mm-hmm. He directed Don John. He does Hit Record, and he has all these other little endeavors that kind of keep him relevant and working. But yeah, in terms of performances, the performances are fantastic just across the board. But what's to me is a more landmark accomplishment is the fact that every character is extremely well developed and dynamic and multifaceted and has complex motivations by the end. Mm-hmm. Like it's like you have old Joe, young Joe, Emily Blunt's character, Sid, Abe, who's played by Jeff Daniels, and he kind of drops out of the story, but it's just enough to keep it going. And you know, old Joe kills him in the end, which, I mean, Joe and Abe have the best dynamic ever. Like this, I think probably the best scene in the movie is the scene where Abe convinces Joe to give up Seth. It's like a 4 or 5 minute scene in his office. It's so well done. It is a perfect scene. And so again, it's just like by the end, you feel like you've spent a lifetime with these characters. You've only been there for an hour and a half, an hour, 45 minutes. I just think every scene and every line of dialogue has a purpose, and not only does it have a purpose, but pretty much all of it lands. I mean, I cannot tell you how hard that is to do as a filmmaker, especially as a writer-director who's not, having checks and balances creatively. Like it's up to Rian Johnson to craft this whole thing. And if it stands on its own two sturdy legs, pretty much all of it's due to Rian Johnson. And if it is filled with holes and it starts to crumble, it's pretty much all Rian Johnson. Yeah. Which is again probably why I think The Last Jedi wasn't so good in places, is because he was given so much autonomy, and I think he kind of struggled or delivered something that was uneven. So it's his strength and his weakness, but in this case, it's an absolute strength.
And also, this film was, I think, kind of a big stepping stone in Emily Blunt's career as sort of a genre performer as well, because her character here just feels so strong and and empowered. I mean, and there's a love scene, but it's really, she instigates it, as opposed to you watch a lot of older films now, and it's like borderline Me Too territory with the way Blade Runner comes to mind, for example, as I'm pretty sure Harrison Ford just raped Sean Young. I don't know. I'm just saying.
It can be, some of the 70s movies can be pretty rapey. Right. It's not so fun to watch anymore.
But the fact that she basically kind of takes over large segments of this movie in the second half, and is so empowered, and is very singular in her focus to protect her son and to ensure his future and to keep his secret and all that. I think it's really It's a really great performance for her, especially at this point. I think she was still known as, Devil Wears Prada and that kind of movie. This basically set the stage for her to become more of a sci-fi action hero in her own right, leading kind of into Edge of Tomorrow a couple years later.
I think like her role is an ode to the complexity and immense responsibility of a mother. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? Oh, yeah. And the tremendous burden they feel raising kids in a not so savory world, in a very complex world. Like her entire story arc revolves around her kid and her kid's role in the greater Looper narrative. And like, maybe an ode isn't the right word, but kind of like an analysis or a real hard look, because she's a total badass. Mm-hmm. I mean, but she also has vulnerability, but not in like a manic kind of cutesy, like I'm a romantic affection of the lead of Joseph-Gordon Levitt's character. I'm here to have sex with him in Act 2. Right. It's not like
exactly.
It's nothing like that. She's a real organic character with her own struggles, and she's terrified in her own right, but she's also very resolute in her own right, and she has tremendous poise as a mother. But she also, like, after the sex scene, she breaks down and admits that she abandoned her child for a life in the city. Mm-hmm. So she's a deeply flawed character, but not in a way that's like, I need Joseph Gordon-Levitt to fix me so we can have an Act 3 moment where we end up together. It's like, it's so divergent from like all the tropes of action movies or romance story arcs between like a male lead and a female lead.
But you buy
and again, that's
their,
why I'm saying by the end, you buy into it. It's like that is a defined character that is a real breathing person who's going to act organically in the story. It's not like we need her to do this at this point in the movie. It's like she, in her own mind, you can see why she acts the way she does. And she's a dynamic character. And that's why the end is just an intersection of a bunch of character dynamics that's incredibly compelling to watch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100% agree. And you buy into the connection between the two of them, because you get the sense that she's very isolated in her, like literally, like physically isolated, since her and her son are basically on this farm, and that seems like they don't really leave very much because she's trying to protect him and keep him sort of safeguarded. But she's kind of isolated in a lot of ways emotionally just as much as he is, and they find themselves kind of thrust into this situation where they have sort of common goals in a way. And I think, it just feels very organic in that respect. And in a way, too, it also feels like her role here, as far as what you're saying about the strength of vulnerability and sort of her prominence as a mother figure, kind of feels like her role in A Quiet Place is sort of an evolution of that in a lot of ways, or a revisiting.
I haven't even seen A Quiet Place, but I know exactly what you're talking about. I know from a very little I've seen, I know exactly what you mean, and kind of like, she as a star, talking about the actress, it was a breakout performance for her, and Rian Johnson even said this in the Looper commentary. He said, while most of the accolades go to Joseph Gordon-Levitt for anchoring the movie and kind of mixing his own mannerisms with Bruce Willis and giving a real organic performance, Emily Blunt also went through her own transition. Like she's a posh British actress that's kind of like, that was her niche, and now she turns into this kind of dirty blonde Midwestern farmer girl. Like that's not easy to do in its own right. And to do the fact that she did it well and did it pitch perfect is a huge testament to her ability to anchor a movie and take on these meaty roles and really deliver. And I think her career evolution, I mean, she has been fantastic since Looper. I mean, she's playing Mary Poppins. She was really like the star of Edge of Tomorrow in a lot of ways. Like A Quiet Place. She's just fantastic. I think she's a real gem.
Yeah, she's pretty great. So I don't really know if I have that much more to talk about except the ending. We need to get into that ending. So what are your thoughts on the ending? Because I appreciate it, and I like what they're doing as far as, like I said, drawing the parallels between Joe and Sid, and sort of he feels that he has the power to make the right decision for old Joe and that kind of thing. But I could see how some people would sort of see that as kind of an anticlimax, because you would expect a movie like this for like, oh, Abe's forces are going to arrive and there's going to be some crazy shit's going to go down. But instead, it's very simple. He just turns the gun on himself. I don't even think it goes into a close up when he makes the decision. It's a wide shot, or at least a mid shot. Yeah. So How do you feel about that decision that he made? Do you think he made the right call? And do you think the film frames that properly, or does it kind of feel like a little bit of a letdown of a conclusion?
Given how this movie has been so grounded up till now, it's a very precise and realistic depiction of how sacrifice actually works. You know, not everyone has their big Act 3 moment when they have to sacrifice their life for a greater cause. And, you know, there isn't this big 5-minute buildup to, I'll hold them off for you. You know, it's like, and that's fine. It works in its own right. It works in different genres and tones. But, like, this is something where, like, Joe sees an opportunity to what's the word, interject or prevent a negative outcome. You know, he has a split-second choice. It's like, do I let this play out and regret this, or do I recognize the immense damage myself and my future self, which I guess is still, you know, rooted in his own personality and inklings, how much crap they've wrecked, you know, for everyone. And he sees, you know, he has nothing really to live for. You know what I'm saying? Like, everything that he cares about is at that farm. You know, it's his older self. It's the life he could have. It's Emily Blunt. It's Sarah. It's Sid. His career is gone. You know, Abe is dead. Everything's in disarray. And it's like, this is his moment where it isn't a big, quote, hero moment. It's like a very, very deeply personal decision to take his own life so that others can live out theirs.
It's a pretty ballsy move for a movie like this to be like, oh, you'd think it would be a huge, like, he chases after, like, Bruce Willis is chasing Emily Blunt and Joseph-Gordon Levitt's chasing Bruce Willis, and he catches up and he's like, you stole my life, punches him.
Yeah, exactly.
Like
in a lesser movie, that's how it would play
sequence.
out.
But instead, it's a total, like, it's a movie where the big heroic act is suicide. You know, that's really
it's dark.
daring. It's really daring for Rian Johnson to go that route. And I wasn't saying that. I'm not saying it's an anticlimax, but I'm kind of playing devil's advocate a little bit here. That I could see how people who are more looking for more of a traditional action thriller would be sort of like, oh, he shoots himself. Oh, okay. But I think thematically it has a lot more weight that someone who is basically just a hitman decides, you know what, I've been saving all this silver, but this is the better decision to protect this young boy, to protect his mother, who's the one that's presumably to prevent him from becoming this kind of horrific figure in the future. Yeah. So I think it works.
Lives. I think the ending is so somber is the best word. I don't know why that ending affects me so much, but like every time I finish watching that movie, I just want to like go give someone a big hug and like just like cry on their shoulder, or just like sit in a dark room and think about life, because it hits on something so deep, and kind of like there's a really weird visual tie-in to an Act 1 moment where Joe says to the prostitute Susie, he's like basically doesn't want to have sex with her. He wants her to like run her hands through his hair a certain way, like his mother used to do. Like that's the only time he's known like true affectionate human contact, you know?
Right.
And obviously that doesn't go well when you ask a prostitute to like play with your hair. It's kind of a little, you know, doesn't play out as with the novelty that you would expect.
Right.
But in the end, like when Joe has killed himself, you know, his older self has disappeared because of the whole grandfather paradox. Emily Blunt like kneels down to him by the field and like affectionately rubs, you know, puts her hand through his hair in the same way that we know is significant, but she doesn't know. It's like a dramatic irony. Like we know something the characters don't.
Oh, yeah,
and it's this beautiful. Oh, really? Yeah, it's this beautiful shot with a sunset and a silhouette, and the music is just so. It's not even like heart wrenching. It's not dramatic. It's just so somber for the occasion, and it ends with like a fulfillment, a very paradoxical fulfillment. And a real finality that you wouldn't expect. But again, Rian Johnson knew what he was doing, and it leaves you thinking, and it leaves you having felt like you've gone on a real journey with these characters, and it just leaves you with such a complexity of emotions and feelings. It's a movie that sticks with you, and I think that's why it did so well with critics. I mean, I really think in the next decade or two, we're just going to continue to look back on this movie as like a classic. If our kids go to film school, they're going to look at Looper as like that movie that was a staple of the thriller or sci-fi genre of this decade. I really do. I'm not trying to be dramatic. I'm not trying to be snobby. I think it's that damn good.
That's a pretty good note to transition into. So I guess what is, sort of our final thoughts. So obviously,
sure, like a rating.
You sort of said it could be a rating. It could just be like, I guess the big question: does this film hold up? And I think you just answered that. I think you kind of got to jump on it.
At least What about you?
I think it's a really strong sci-fi thriller. I don't love it as much as you, because I do. There are certain things, like some of the flaws that I did mention. I actually do kind of bring it down slightly for me, but I think for the most part, it's a really fresh and sort of strange and piece of sci-fi filmmaking. The fact that it is kind of fearless in going as dark as it does, I think is a credit to Rian Johnson's accomplishment here as both a writer and director. So I definitely think it's worth recommending to people that haven't seen it. If they're listening to this, we just spoiled the whole movie for you. So sorry, but you didn't heed the spoiler warning up front, I guess. But yeah, I definitely hope that it's a film that will continue to grow in esteem. And coming from me, I'm a Rian Johnson fan in general. So I think if people, whether they liked or hated The Last Jedi and their whole feelings about him as a filmmaker, if they haven't seen this, I think they should. It's worth going back and watching his first 3 films and kind of appreciating his, what he can do when he's coming from his own, creating his own vision and not having to deal with a very, very temperamental fan base of such an established property. So yeah, it's a great film.
Yeah, for me, I would feel dishonest not giving it a perfect score. Because while I mentioned some flaws with like production or some minor gripes, I can't. I think every movie, even Lord of the Rings in its best moment, has imperfections, and do those imperfections hamper the story or the believability? And in Looper, for me, the answer is always no. So yeah. I don't know if you do ratings, but I would give it a full marks. I would probably do a 4 out of 5, which is like a B+ or something, I guess. Yeah, no, it's ish B+, A-. It's really hard for me to go 5, and I want to give this a 4.5, but I don't know. I don't know if it's quite there for me. Yeah, we've done like 8 episodes of the Screen Fever podcast. I don't think I've ever given a movie a 5 out of 5. Even Game Night, which is like one of my favorite comedies ever, I gave it a 4.5 out of 5. Like, I save this rating for movies that I really care about. And so I'm not a guy who throws out perfect scores, but this is a perfect score.
Well, it was a good choice for you then, for this to be the film that we talk about, I guess.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, that's all we have for now. You could subscribe to the Crooked Table podcast on iTunes. You consider contributing to our Patreon page at patreon.com/crookedtable. You can also rate and review the Crooked Table podcast and help others find the show. Adam, where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, at Adam Barnard. So it's like my last name with missing 2 letters, just Bnard. That's like my handle on Instagram and Twitter. I'm also at Real Screen Fever on Twitter and Screen Fever on YouTube. That's our channel if you want to sample some of the content and hear some of the discussions that I have with Jackson, and also hear Robert on our channel, because you've done two videos to discuss. Three. Oh yeah.
Oh, the Boba Fett, Kevin Smith, and then
Boba Fett. Yeah, and the State of the Fandom. And it's interesting, like the Kevin Smith video is like the second most viewed video on our channel, because as we were talking about earlier, niche content works. Everyone is a podcast about a Marvel movie, but like I've actually found if you Google Kevin Smith Moose Jaws, our video comes up on like the top results.
Oh, awesome.
So like, yeah, it was totally unintentional, but I wanted to kind of service a fandom or a movie or a news piece that isn't ubiquitously serviced.
Right.
And like in that, you find you have an audience. People who are also fans of that one small guy's side project. It's like you have to take a ton of twists and turns down the labyrinth, but once you get there, it's like the people who are listening to that really want to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully, like Looper, this can be a real substantive discussion for other people who are kind of have like a cult fandom of that, or of Looper itself, or Rian Johnson's filmography.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me, Robert Yaniz Jr., on Twitter at Crooked Table. Of course, find more podcasts, reviews, videos, and other movie-related goodies at crookedtable.com. Adam, thanks so much for joining me. This was a lot of fun, and we'll have to cycle back once I cycle through more guests. We'll have to bring you on to talk about another film.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me back. I appreciate these kinds of discussions. I really like our dynamic, and like I loved hearing your analysis. I'm excited to hear the other guests you bring in. Given that each week you're kind of introducing a new voice, I think that's really cool, and it'll really keep things fresh.
Yeah, that's the goal. We'll see how it goes. If you're interested in joining me on the show to chat about one of your favorite films, head on over to crookedtable.com/guest. Or you can consider supporting the show at patreon.com/crookedtable. Of course, you can always find more podcasts, reviews, videos, and other movie-related goodies over at crookedtable.com. Until next time, this has been the Crooked Table Podcast, and I've been Rob.
This has been a production of crookedtable.com. All rights reserved.
The art of the low KED.